All right, this is a demo on how to think about using your grid and also about how to design the grid based on what your content looks like. So, anyway, for this little demo, I'm doing Jackson Pollock. He was part of the abstract expressionist movement. And so, what I did was, well, let's just talk about what I did first. Is I looked at his artwork, right? And he has a lot of horizontal artwork. And so a grid that has a lot of, let me unlock this for a moment. So a grid that's got a lot of columns is going to help divide the space more flexibly with horizontal layout, with horizontal artwork. If you've got a lot of vertical stuff, then you might consider a grid that has more vertical divisions than horizontal. So it's just a matter of seeing what you've got. So Pollock's work is primarily horizontally based. So I picked a 7-column grid because that gives me the most options. I also spaced the grid out. So when I'm going to look at the grid, okay, so this is what the grid looks like when you turn a grid on, and right now I've got my grid set to 1-inch increments, and I've got 12 subdivisions inside of that because I was working with a floor plan. I was working with barn plans to do things to scale for my new barn. And so this is a 1/4 inch equals 3 feet, right? So that's why I have this grid set up. You can set the grid up any which way you want, but I left it in there because it gives me 1-inch squares, and I'm using an 8.5 by 8.5 square format, which gives me a 17 by 8.5 page spread layout. Okay, so I like squares. I think squares are cool, and I think they work well for a neat brochure and catalog designs like what we're doing here. So that was my grid. I laid out a 1-inch square, and so then let me just turn off these other layers for a moment, just so we can talk a little bit about the artwork itself. There we go. So here's the grid. So what I did was close that up. Is I started my first grid and I just made a 1-inch square, and then I duplicated it a whole bunch of times, right? So this is what it ended up looking like, okay? That was my step 1. Then I used my align tool and I used my distribute. So I distributed horizontal centers so that the whole, layers, all the columns would be equally spaced. Then I duplicated this and I spread it out 6 times, so I have 6 rows, right? And so I just option dragged each one, right? Option drag, right? I just dragged it out like that, so on and so forth. I'm going to just undo that real quick. And then once I had it all spread out, I grabbed this group and I distributed them vertically so that they were all even that way. So now I had them evenly spaced this way, evenly spaced this way, but maybe the guys in here weren't all equally spaced, right? So what you do is you grab each row and then you distribute toward the bottom, okay? So this way it'll align everything to the bottom of that particular square that we first started out with. And you repeat that process for every row. Notice I've got a little bit of a space in between, and this is an arbitrary, it's not really arbitrary, it's 1/12 of the actual grid size. And so, but it could be arbitrary. I didn't really say, okay, this is what it's going to be. I just spaced it out so that because I like tight grids, I like tight alleys, okay? And remember, those spaces in between the modules are what's known as alleys, right? So and this right here is the gutter. This is the binding edge between the 2 pages. Okay, so I decided that's what my grid was going to be. And then I just simply copied it and duplicated it and brought it over here. And notice that it was 2 squares to the left of the primary division. So mine over here is 2 squares to the right of the primary division. So we just talked about how to make the grid. Now notice something else. These are what's known as margins. If you recall that other layer, that other lecture, margins are good things. And when you are dealing with an RD type situation like this, big margins make it look cool. And so notice I've got a 1-inch margin, a top margin, just slightly less than an inch on the right margin, and then again, almost the same on the binding edge. If you want to, you can even have the binding edge have even more space. Like say I might move that out 2 more squares, which will then give my binding a little bit wider area, and that looks, in the gutter, and that can be kind of fun, right? So, okay, so there's my margins, and again, having a nice big margin, the foot margin it gives a sense of elegance. Okay, so now I've got my grid all laid out. I'm going to turn off my base grid, and now I've just got my grid. Okay, so when you're setting up your layers, you want to set up a layer just for your grid, and you want it to be at the bottom, and then you want to lock it down, because once your grid's there, you don't want to muck it up, right? So the next thing I decided I wanted to do is add a graphic element. Now, this is what I decided to do. I'm going to move that over because I changed my grid. I decided, because this is abstract expressionism and a lot of it had to do with paint flying everywhere, so I just grabbed a piece of a painting, and I brought it into Photoshop, and I just deleted the background color so that it's transparent. It could be white, it doesn't really matter, but if you had a color on your page, then you'd want that color to come through. And then what I did here was transparency, and I bumped the transparency of that down to 13%. Okay, so you can see, that's what it kind of looked like. And at full opacity, this is what it looked like, right? But I only wanted it to be a texture in the background, so I knocked it way, way back, okay? So that's something you can think about doing. And you can grab pieces of paintings and just crop them. You could do whatever you want. So if you want to crop an image in Illustrator, it's pretty easy. All you need is your graphic. And then you simply draw a rectangle around the part that you'd like to crop. You select both, and then you go into Object, Clipping Mask, Make, and bam, you've got yourself a portion of your artwork, okay? So that's a pretty cool thing. I'm just going to undo that. Okay, so I added some texture. I actually added that later, but I'm just deconstructing this project for you. So then let's turn on our layers again. And so now I got nothing on that layer, and I've got a whole bunch of stuff on this layer. So I'm going to turn off my grid for a moment, just so you can see what it looks like. Select that. So let's talk about what happened here. Okay, so notice my title for Jackson Pollock. He was one of the most famous artists of that movement. And look what I did with his name. Okay, I added a mask onto a painting to add some graphic, interest to his name. Okay, notice that I just grabbed a script. It's not the one I probably would have picked, but I just wanted a nice contrasty typeface so that you could see, what I keep talking about when I talk about contrast and type. This is something that we should have picked up in the last exercise, right? And I'm not seeing it happening yet, but you want to think about this a lot, because when you have contrast and type, hey, it makes it look interesting. Put it on an angle, put a drop shadow on it so it pulled it off a little bit. I'm not a big fan of drop shadows, but every once in a while they're a good thing. So this is about 160 words. And this is something else. I'm going to lock that layer down. No, turn that off, lock that. There we go. A lot of you are putting a lot of text in there. And remember in the specs, I said 1 to 2 paragraph bio. Okay, that's about 100 to 150 words. I picked about, basically all I did was I went onto Wikipedia, and I wanted you to draw, to write your own. But I just grabbed this, right? Bam. Okay, so the first part of it was a very brief description of the years he lived and so on. I made it a little bit bigger. Notice the typeface I'm using. Actually, let me do this. Notice the typeface I'm using. It's a condensed typeface, which means that it'll fit more words into a smaller space, thereby giving me more opportunity for negative space because I'm not using up a lot of space with the typeface that's big and heavy and bold. I used a light weight so that it has a little bit of elegance, and I've added some leading in between the lines so that it looks a little bit more elegant as well. So these are all things that you can do to think about making your design look cooler, right? So I've got two different typefaces going, or two different sizes, and then I just used a normal spacing, just kind of a normal set solid, or a set 8, I think it's 9.9, I think it's 9 on 12 or 9 on 11. But let's take a look at what I did. Okay, so I'm going to just grab that here. Let's open up the character. And this is Roboto, one of my more favorite typefaces these days. It's in the lightweight. It's set 9, and so it's almost 9 on 11. And so I might even want to perhaps just move that to 11 just to kind of make it comfortable. 2-point leading is considered a nice standard space between your lines. Now, that being said, you can see this one, it's 9 points set on 16. So that means that there's 5 points of leading in between each of the lines of text. And it adds up to a little bit more space, but it looks cooler, right? And it also adds a little bit of interest because now we have some differences in the way the type looks. I could conceivably go, let's see, it was also called action painting, right? And I might even say, wow, I'm just going to make that bold. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to lighten that up. I'm going to put it to be bold, right? And so now I have a little bit of interest because I've just added a little bit of weight to make something stand out a little bit. I could even, and this is going to make the line spacing look weird, but I could even increase the size of the text inside of the body text. That sometimes mucks up the line spacing, sometimes not. In this case, it looks like it did a pretty nice job. So you can play around with those kinds of things. I didn't do anything with callouts or with pull quotes or any of that stuff, but certainly those are options that you can do as well. Now let's look a little bit at, and close that up. Okay, let's look at the whole spread for a moment. Notice I've been using different sizes for the artwork. Okay, first I got a little picture of Jackson there having a good time painting. And it's not a bad idea to have something like that occur, right? Just kind of give you an idea of who the artist looked like, what the artist looked like, you know, and he's doing his action painting thing, getting really involved and so on and so forth. Notice that what's happening in his painting that he's working on emulates what I picked for the background area, right? So there's some, you know, a little jiving going on there. Everybody's kind of playing in the same sandbox there. Notice I've also used different sizes of the paintings. I picked 4. You can pick between 3 and 5. Now, I'm not crazy about the stacking, right? It's little, medium, big, that kind of stuff sort of bugs me. And so I'd work on that a little bit, right? So this would be a version of the layout that I would save, and then I would muck around with the placement and the size and so on and so forth. So what I would do here then is I'd basically turn my grid back on, and then I would just start playing around, moving things, right? And so some of them I didn't move any of my artwork, right, when I did that, which was bad because I mucked up everything, right? So now I need to kind of scoot everybody back. And notice what I did here, okay? This is right here, see that line? Nothing crosses the line, nothing goes above it, nothing goes below it. So everything either moves up from that or moves down from it. This is what's known as a flow line. Flow lines are cool because they create the sense of horizontal consistency as you go through the pages. Ideally, what will happen is that as I move through these different pages of my document, That flow line will stay consistent. So nothing will ever cross that. It'll always be a consistent element. And that adds a lot of interest. Notice what I did here. I did a bleed. You can break the grid. Grids aren't there to simply be, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? I didn't move these guys either, so I'm going to scoot these guys over. Didn't grab that guy either. Looks about right. Gonna scoot him over. Okay, cool. And so notice that my little alleys, see how they work? You know, there's a nice tight spacing. Everything is nice and tidy. I didn't scoot this up to the top. I could have, but I'd rather have it set at the bottom. This actually needs to come down a little bit. And these are the kinds of things that I would really work on, you know. The top line here, not that important. And I could probably open up that leading just a little bit more. So let me just open that up a little bit and see what happens. And so here I might go, okay, the leading at 17 is too much. But I could simply go in here and put 16.5. And it's just about right. Right? It fits right into my grid along the top line and along the base line. Same thing here. Notice that, I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit so you can see what's going on. It's not quite right, right? If I really wanted that to be right, I'd go back into here and I'd make this 11.2. Maybe a little more. How about 11.5? Could take a little bit more, 11.6. And so these are the kinds of things that you want to be really aware of. And that looks about right. Yeah, perfect. Okay, I might even want to, actually, I need to drop that down a little bit. That looks about right. There we go. And I'm just looking at just very, very tight alignments with the grid so that everything feels really well organized. And you got to get in tight to do this, right? I'm gonna move that over one. Okay, so noticing everything's nice and tight. Scooting on over. I'm looking at this. That looks good. Facing page. When you're doing your captions, all you need is the name of the painting, the year it was done, the medium, and its size. That's all you need. Okay? And when you're dealing with your 150 words of text, the only thing you really need is when the guy lived, and if he had a title or whatever, and then what he did in the movement. You don't have to go through his whole history, where he was born, where he went to school. All we're really trying to talk about is what that artist did in that movement. That's all we're doing. And so that's all you need to do. Okay, so don't add heaps of text. I'm doing this specifically so that you don't fill up all your artwork space with text. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about how I did this little story right here. So I'm going to zoom out just slightly. Whoa, slow down, killer. Okay, let's scoot this over here a little bit. Bam. Okay, so notice how cool this looks, right? It's really awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go into Object, Clipping Mask, and I'm going to release the mask here for a moment. Okay, so you're like, whoa. All I did was I grabbed a piece of artwork, and I dragged it underneath his name, and I looked for a place that had more dark than light. And as a matter of fact, I could probably, I got that all selected here. I'm going to just scoot that over a little bit. Kind of just seeing, you know, trying to find an area that's pretty dense. That looks about right. Okay, so then this goes directly underneath your text. So you select your text and you select your piece of graphic. They should be right on top of each other. So the text should be just on top. And you just go into Object, Clipping Mask, Make. Bam. And then you've got a cool graphic behind your text. Obviously, the more bold the text, the more effective the mask, okay? So, pretty cool, pretty easy there. And what else can I talk about here? Let me just zoom back out here. Scoot that over, close that up. Okay, so I think I've just talked about everything that I did to this layout, and I hope that helps you to, to work with it a little bit. Notice here, one other thing now that I'm thinking about it. I'm going to turn on my rulers, and I'm always looking for opportunities here. And so notice that even though this doesn't line up on the grid right here, right? Let me just zoom in on that here. Okay. It doesn't line up on the grid. But notice what happens here. I decided that I was going to make the artwork, and it was almost a happy accident because I was trying to fill the columns, and just amazingly, it actually worked with this piece of artwork, which is 4 columns, and this one is 5 columns. And so you want to think about those possibilities as well. You never want to pass up an opportunity to align things when you can. Okay, so that was something that I just sort of thought about, and I think the grids are probably locked. So I'm gonna just turn off my grids. Grid. Gotta turn off the layer. Sorry, layer off. Bam. View grids. So where's my grid? Snap to grid. I don't want to do that. What's that? Where are my view grids? Rulers. Guides. Unlock guides. Okay. I just wanted to unlock that guide so I could get rid of it. Okay, so that's basically it. And that's, pretty cool layout. It took me, I don't know, 30 minutes or so to pull that together. When I was looking for artwork, all I did was I looked for, let's see, window, how about Jackson Pollock? I just looked first for abstract expressionism so that I could find paintings that were indicative of that movement. And then I looked up Jackson Pollock, and then I just went through and grabbed images. I grabbed a bit of content from Wikipedia. And again, I want you to write your own, but I was just trying to make it look realistic for you guys. And so that's what I did. So I hope this helps you think about how you can design your pages and your layouts. Okay? So have some fun.